The United States spent decades securing Europe as a key buyer of its natural gas. Billions poured into infrastructure, diplomatic deals, and energy exports. Now, Europe is making a game-changing pivot. Canada, yes, Canada is stepping in to replace American gas. Washington didn't just see this coming, it may have pushed Europe right into Canada's arms. This isn't just about fuel. This is about geopolitical power, economic dominance, and global trade wars. If the United States loses its grip on Europe's energy market, what happens next? Could this unravel America's standing in not just energy, but green technology, trade, and global influence? Stick around because this isn't just an energy shift. This could be the beginning of a seismic economic realignment. For years, Europe relied on Russia for nearly 40% of its natural gas. That was until the Ukraine war forced a radical shift. The United States stepped in, becoming Europe's top supplier, shipping record levels of LNG. Washington celebrated the victory, until now. Reports from Reuters and Bloomberg confirm that the European Union is cutting back on U.S. gas imports in favor of Canada. The shift isn't speculation, it's happening now. But why Canada? 3 key reasons. Stability. Canada has no trade wars, no major political disputes with Europe. Unlike the United States, it doesn't weaponize energy and diplomatic spats. Lower emissions. The EU's Green Deal demands suppliers meet strict climate regulations. Canadian LNG production has lower emissions than U.S. gas, a major selling point. Long-term contracts. While the United States sells much of its LNG on short-term markets, Canada is offering long-term stability, which European buyers prefer. So, did the United States pushes Europe away with its own trade policies? Washington prides itself on energy independence, but its own trade restrictions are backfiring. The Inflation Reduction Act, sanctions, and protectionist tariffs have frustrated European leaders. Just look at the numbers. U.S. LNG exports to the EU dropped by nearly 10% in Q4 2023, according to the IEA and Energy Information Administration. Canada's energy exports to Europe surged by over 30% in the same period, according to the Canadian energy regulator. And then there's the carbon tax fight. The EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism penalizes high-emission energy imports. Canadian gas has a lower carbon footprint than U.S. exports, making it cheaper under new EU rules. This shift didn't happen overnight, it's a slow-moving but deliberate decoupling. Which brings us to an even bigger question. What makes Canada a more attractive energy supplier than the United States? Besides the lower emissions and stable policies, Canada offers something the United States doesn't: geopolitical neutrality. No Trump-era tariffs that strained U.S.-EU relations. No threats of sanctions on European businesses. No fears of economic retaliation when leadership changes in Washington. And then there's the infrastructure play. Canada is expanding its LNG export capacity, with new terminals coming online by 2025. Its government is actively incentivizing energy investments, making long-term deals more attractive than volatile U.S. pricing. But this isn't just about gas. If Europe is choosing Canada over the United States for energy, what does this mean for America's economic power on the global stage? Europe's pivot to Canada is more than just a trade realignment. It's a direct challenge to the economic dominance the United States built through energy exports. Since 2022, American LNG has accounted for nearly 50% of Europe's gas imports, generating $73 billion in export revenue in 2023 alone, according to the U.S. Department of Energy. But as European contracts begin shifting to Canada, analysts at Goldman Sachs warn this could cost U.S. exporters billions annually. Washington's ability to wield energy as a diplomatic tool, whether in trade talks or sanctions enforcement, diminishes with every new Canadian deal. The longer Europe locks into long-term contracts with Canada, the harder it becomes for U.S. energy firms to reclaim lost ground. Industry experts argue that this isn't just a temporary shift, it's part of a global realignment. The International Energy Agency reports that U.S. LNG shipments to Europe declined by 9% in the last quarter of 2023, while Canada's gas exports surged by over 30% in the same period. Energy economist Dr. Antoine Hauff warns that this transition isn't about short-term pricing. It's about Europe securing stable, lower-emission energy sources for the long haul. The United States still holds the world's largest LNG capacity, but with the EU prioritizing supply stability and green regulations, American gas may face permanent disadvantages unless Washington makes a strategic shift. Canada's expanding role in global energy isn't limited to Europe. It's carving out a larger share of the Asian market as well. According to the Canadian energy regulator, Canada's LNG shipments to Asia grew by 42% in 2023, with China and Japan securing long-term contracts. This means Canada is undermining U.S. energy dominance on multiple fronts. Morgan Stanley energy strategist Devin McDermott explains that as Canada scales up new export terminals, it will become a direct competitor to the U.S. in global energy markets, reducing America's leverage in trade negotiations, sanctions, and energy-based diplomacy. If Washington fails to respond effectively, it risks watching Canada replace it as the preferred supplier not just in Europe, but in Asia as well. Europe's shift to Canadian gas is being matched by an even more significant transition: its preference for Canadian critical minerals over U.S. sources. The EU's Critical Raw Materials Act aims to reduce dependence on China, and Canada is emerging as the top alternative. According to Bloomberg, European automakers increased Canadian lithium imports by 48% in 2023, while nickel and cobalt shipments also surged. Volkswagen and Stellantis have both inked supply deals with Canadian mines, bypassing the U.S. due to regulatory barriers and Inflation Reduction Act complexities. Mark Widmar, CEO of battery manufacturer QuantumScape, notes that Europe sees Canada as a more stable, regulation-friendly partner, while U.S. mineral policies have created supply chain bottlenecks that push buyers elsewhere. While Europe's rhetoric suggests a push for energy independence, the numbers reveal a different reality. Data from Eurostat shows that Canada now accounts for 18% of Europe's LNG supply, up from just 5% in 2022, while U.S. market shares drop below 45%. Some analysts argue that this isn't true diversification, but a strategic reshuffling to reduce exposure to American trade policies. Dr. Kadri Simpson, the EU's energy commissioner, stated that Europe is looking for long-term stability and regulatory alignment, which makes Canada a more predictable partner than Washington. If Canada becomes Europe's primary energy and mineral supplier, it could centralize European dependence on Ottawa, making energy security no more diversified than before, just less entangled with U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. led the charge in clean energy investments, but Europe's pivot suggests that America isn't keeping up with evolving trade dynamics. While Washington poured over $370 billion into clean energy subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act, much of the funding prioritizes domestic industries at the expense of international partnerships. The result? European automakers and energy firms are turning to Canada, which offers a more accessible, policy-aligned supply chain. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, Canada's clean energy exports to Europe grew 35% in 2023, while U.S. exports stalled due to policy roadblocks. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, warns that America risks falling behind in the green transition if it continues prioritizing domestic incentives over global supply chain integration. Washington isn't just watching from the sidelines. Tensions are brewing. In early 2024, U.S. officials raised concerns with EU trade leaders over Canada's growing energy and mineral market share. The U.S. Trade Representative's office has hinted that new tariffs or restrictions on Canadian imports may be considered if America's market position continues to weaken. However, Europe has no intention of reversing course, as confirmed by European Commission Vice President Maroš Šefčovič, who stated that Canada's energy and mineral resources align more closely with EU regulatory goals. If the U.S. attempts to counter Canada's rise with trade penalties, it could spark retaliatory measures, creating a three-way trade war that disrupts not just energy markets, but also automotive and manufacturing industries. The Biden administration isn't backing down quietly. In response to Europe's shift toward Canada, Washington is pushing for new energy agreements that offer incentives for European buyers to stick with American suppliers. U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm confirmed in January that the administration is working on policy adjustments to keep American LNG competitive in global markets. There's also speculation that Washington may introduce tax credits for U.S. energy firms to offset EU carbon penalties. But the question remains, is it already too late? If European buyers continue signing long-term contracts with Canada, Washington's efforts might be too little, too late. If the U.S. fails to counter this transition, the consequences could be irreversible. A $73 billion market at stake, waning trade influence, and reduced leverage in global negotiations. This isn't just an economic issue, it's a shift in geopolitical power. Goldman Sachs energy strategist Callum Bruce warns that if Washington doesn't intervene quickly, America risks being sidelined in the very markets it once dominated. This would weaken not just energy exports, but the broader transatlantic economic relationship. The U.S. built its post-Ukraine war energy strategy on being Europe's go-to supplier, but with Canada taking that role, Washington's grip on global energy dominance is slipping fast. This isn't just another trade shift. This could be the tipping point for America's energy influence. With Canada securing long-term deals, Europe is effectively rebuilding its supply chains without Washington. If the U.S. doesn't find a way to counter this shift, it could be locked out of Europe's energy market for decades. But here's the bigger question. Is this the first domino to fall? If the U.S. loses control over European energy markets, will other global partners follow suit? Could this spark a broader realignment in global trade? The answers may come sooner than expected, and when they do, they could change the world order forever. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.